And we're back. This is Rapid Application Development Lesson 12/13, Part 2. So we're talking about advanced validation techniques. So up until now, our validation techniques have allowed you to do things like use try-catch blocks and so on. And you can use if statements, any kind of conditional statements, message boxes to provide feedback to the user saying, hey, this is wrong. You need to enter this data, right? But there's some other techniques you can use. ErrorProvider is kind of cool, right? It reminds me a lot of, web form kind of feedback, somewhat. But I do like, to myself, when I kind of do forms for whether they're for the web or for a control, I like to code it so that way when there's an error, you change the background of your text box to like red or something like that. That's a kind of a standard event, a standard effect these days. And then when you're good, and if you've entered it properly, as an example, after they finished entering, maybe a green, say, hey, you've entered it all right, you can move on now, right? But sometimes green is a little bit annoying. So just red for this is wrong. It's required. Some kind of an asterisk that says these are required fields would be good too, right? But the one thing is that you can set the max length and character casing properties of text boxes to kind of do some field level validation. We'll talk about that in a second. So max length, of course, would be if you only want to have a maximum length, let's say, of 2 characters, and you don't want to have the user enter any additional characters, just 2. For example, a province text box that only allows you to enter 2 characters. So ErrorProvider is another way, instead of using a message box to provide feedback and a pop-up, which can kind of be annoying because a message box kind of stops the whole program in its tracks. So it's a modal form that comes up. They have to click away from it, and it looks like it's a big kind of hassle for it to come up. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time too, and sometimes, depending if you have multiple windows open in Windows, it can screw you up. You might have a message box that pops up behind another window somehow, and then you can't get to it, and then you don't know why, but your application is kind of locked, right? So it can provide issues, but ErrorProvider is another way of doing it without a message box. So how does it look? So general form is, instead of putting a message box, you say, this is the control name that you're going to put this ErrorProvider object, you're going to use it, and this is the message you're going to provide. So example would be, I'm going to set the error to the ErrorProvider to quantity text box to say the quantity must be numeric, right? And it's not going to pop up an error. It's going to pop up a little flashing dot that comes up that says there's a problem, right? Take a look at this, how it looks in a second. So here's an example. You've got your quantity text box, and you're gonna kind of clear the error at the beginning because you're gonna have to do this every time you come back to you're entering your quantity text box, and then you're gonna make sure that the string is set to empty for your price text box as an example, right? You can do either way. Both ways are the same. It kind of works the same. And then this is an example from a previous lesson where you're using quantities and your quantity and your price, and you kind of get this extended price, decimal, and so on. And then if it doesn't work out, you use a try-catch block, but instead of using a try-catch block with a message box, use a try-catch block with an ErrorProvider. Okay? Let's take a look and see how this works. So I've kind of provided, again, another example here. So File. We're going to open up a solution that's on your Blackboard again, if you'd like to follow along. Here's ErrorProvider, and I'm going to open this up. Now this, my book sale form, here it is, right? So again, this is something we've seen in a previous lesson before, right? So if I run this thing, and example, I don't put in a quantity, right? I put in like some kind of other value, like a D, and I move on, right? Instead of a numeric value, all of a sudden, right, what it should do is when I do calculate, it's going to come up with, hey, there's an issue, right? The quantity must be numeric, and it's going to flash. It won't allow me to do this, to do the calculation at all, right? If I put a 1 in here, right, and I don't put in a title, I don't put in a price, and I do calculate, it's going to say you need a price, right, and it's going to flash. Price must be numeric. It's a different form of doing, kind of providing feedback to the user. I kind of like it, and I kind of don't like it, right? I kind of like it because it's a little bit more subtle than an ugly message box that pops up, like an alert box. Yeah.
Is it always that icon?
You can change the icon. You can control different things. You can also change whether it flashes or not. There's all kinds of little controls you can put on it, right? But typically, it's some kind of icon that comes up. But I personally like some kind of text that comes along that says, maybe even in the text box says, required. Now, even something that comes right in here that says required and highlights it and says you need to put a numeric value, some kind of feedback to the user that has to go back. That may not be a message box, but this is what it does. If you look at the code behind it really quickly, again, it looks exactly like what we saw in our example, right? Here we have a ErrorProvider, and we kind of set the quantity text box. Every time you do a calculate button, anytime you click the calculate button, it clears your error first, right? And this is one of the things you need to do, clear your error before you enter different data in. We're going to see another example of this in another project that I've created for you guys as well. Oops. Yeah, let me just put this in another window for us, just for now, so I can switch between them a little better. All right. So ErrorProvider, again, an alternate compared to message box. Message box is okay. ErrorProvider provides a different option. Character casing. Okay, so you put in a province. In this particular case, it's a state, and you're going to put a province of Ontario as an example. You want whatever the user enters, you want it to automatically be uppercase. Well, you can use the character casing property of the actual control at design time to force the user. It forces the input as uppercase, so you don't have to convert it at runtime. You convert it at design time. So as soon as the user enters any kind of data, it becomes uppercase right away. Okay, and again, we can set the maximum length property, MaxLength property of this text box to 2 characters, so they can't possibly enter anything greater than 2 characters. But there is something else that's missing from this validation, which is, what if they enter less than 2 characters? Or what if they enter a state that doesn't exist or a province that doesn't exist? Right? These are the things you should also be checking. Right? So validation is not just do they enter the right number of characters, but also are they entering proper data? Right? And this is the kind of stuff you have to think about when you create a control. How can I break the control? You should ask yourself. If I have a user, what if they put in something else in here? Could they break my code? Right? And if they can, or if they're going to give you invalid data, especially in a database, you want to stop the user from providing invalid data as much as possible without making it as too annoying for the user if they make a mistake. Again, we can create something called FieldLevel Validation, right? And what we do here is we use something called a validating event. A validating event. And it fires as soon as the user enters any data. We'll see how it works. So here's an example. You can say, first of all, if you have a name text box, like first name text box as an example, right? And you want it to listen to the validating event, you have to turn on this causes validation property to true on whatever the text box is or the control that you want to validate. And here's an example of some code that would go along with it. You use the ErrorProvider again, and you say, well, I want to clear any kind of error, right? And here it is. I'm saying if my text box for my name is empty, so if the user decides not to enter this required field, then, well, I want to do 2 things. I want to cancel the ErrorProvider event, so I'm going to turn that little arrow that comes up, right? And I want to kind of set the ErrorProvider to, hey, it's a required field as it blinks, right? So I canceled the event, so otherwise when you come back here, it'll kind of continue flashing afterwards. Okay. So let's see how this works in a second. Before we do this, I want to talk about capturing keystrokes. So sometimes you only want to let a user enter only a certain type of data. Like, for example, only numeric data. You're not going to accept the field itself will not allow you to enter any other kind of data. Like, for example, if you're trying to put in alphanumeric data in a phone number, the field shouldn't even allow it to put in, and so it stops the user. It actually prevents you from having to put together if statements to say if it's not numeric, as an example, then give the user feedback. It shouldn't even allow you to type in anything non-numeric. Okay. So any other additional keystrokes, basically, it actually listens for all the keystrokes, but it throws them away in the bit bucket, right? So it doesn't like not listen for the keystrokes. It still listens, but it just doesn't accept anything or even accepts any kind of data at all that's not the required data that you're listening for. So here's an example. So all I'm listening for is if it's a digit, right? You're listening for this key character type of event that's coming through the key press event args. When you create this key press event on a particular text box, as an example, and you're also making sure that it's either some kind of digit, as an example, so is digit, you're using the is digit method, or it equals to a dot. So either a dot or a digit. It can't be anything else. Now there's a problem here, and I think I modified this in your code. I'm going to show you in a second, because it also stops you from putting any kind of backspace character. It won't work. It'll throw that in the bit bucket too, right? Which doesn't make any sense. So it makes it really hard for the user to enter data. Once they enter the wrong data, like they enter the wrong number, you can't get back to it, right? Unless like you double click and somehow delete it. You have to use your mouse with it, right? You can actually press the backspace key, which is bad, right? So I've kind of put in another piece of code here in a second. I'll show you. One other thing that we haven't touched upon in this course, but I'm going to mention, and if this is one of the key skills I think that all programmers should have, is you need to know how to do different kinds of, basically what you have to know, if you think about is these general expressions. We're going to talk about using expressions, right? Regular expressions to kind of figure out, to do a search and validation. Who does not know anything about regular expressions? Have you guys all had some kind of regular expression training? I'm hoping, right? If you haven't, I recommend, and I go to the people that are online that might be listening to this or watching the video, I recommend, I'm not going to teach it here because it's a little bit out of scope. We don't have a lot of time. But I recommend that you learn at least the basics of regular expressions. And you can go online and find out what they do. Basically, they're a search string of values that you can kind of put in a regular expression for only certain values that you're going to allow for the character to enter, okay? Or the user to enter. Let's take a look at an example that I put together. So again, I'm opening on a project on Blackboard, and then we'll pause here for a bit of a break before we continue. And it's called validation. So I've done a couple of things here that I haven't covered, and I'm going to talk about it here in the form. So here I've got this field level validation, right, as an example. And I do have this ErrorProvider component, because whenever I do ErrorProvider, I use the ErrorProvider. I have to drag and drop this ErrorProvider control into the component bar here, right? So let's run it and see what it does. So here I decide not to enter my first name in this form, right? And I move to last name. Automatically, the ErrorProvider provides some feedback saying it's a required field, right? So just even clicking somewhere else will stop me from moving on. It won't allow me to do it, right? I can't click anywhere and put any kind of data until I take care of my ErrorProvider right here, right? It'll actually just redirect me back to this, gives this field focus again, and it forces me to enter my name, right? So I put in my name, and I can put in whatever I want. That's the other thing. I haven't done that kind of level of validation yet, right? So the name could be gobbledygook if I want it to be, right? It's not going to check to see if it's a real name. Obviously, that's too difficult to do. Here's my last name. I don't feel like putting a last name. I click, and now it's going to say, hey, you need to do this field too. It won't allow me to click anywhere else. It won't even allow me to click back and change my name, right? So kind of good and kind of bad, right? I like it and I don't like it, right? But let's see, I put it in. So here's my last name. Street, I haven't validated, so I can kind of leave these fields empty. Province, if I move on, it's going to force me to enter my province. So it needs me to enter province. One thing I've done here is I've used another thing we kind of haven't talked about, but I'll show you how to use in a second. The autocomplete feature that's built into every text box. I start typing O, and it provides me with a list of provinces. If I type, Q as an example, it'll come up with some suggestions for me, right? I'll show you how to do this in your autocomplete, right? If I choose O, I can actually use the arrow to kind of select it and press enter, and it'll accept my input. Then I can move on. Now here's where I use the regular expressions. Because if I put gobbledygook in here, first of all, I limit the characters that can be entered in here to 7, right? So the maximum you're going to have from a postal code perspective is 7 characters. And it's only going to accept the postal code that's the right type of format, because I'm using regular expressions here to figure it out. So if I put all H's in my postal code, which validates the number of characters, and I move on to the next field, it's going to say, I'm sorry, but it's wrong. It's going to say, please enter a valid postal code, right? So I got to enter a valid postal code, but let's say I make it up, right? Let's say I used D's in my postal code, which I believe don't exist in Canadian postal codes. So I go D0E, D or 0D0. I make it up, right? It's the format's right, but the postal code is wrong. It can't exist. And I move on. It's going to say, no, I'm sorry, your postal code's invalid. Even though it matches the type of data, the way it looks like, it's not a valid postal code. So I've checked for that too, and I'll show you how to do that. The amount, if I put in a real postal code, here's my real postal code, right, 1C9, and I move on, it accepts it. It knows that it's a real postal code. I'll show you the little regular expression I use. And the amount, if I put in a number or a letter, it doesn't accept me to put in, doesn't allow me to put in any alphanumeric characters. However, it will allow me to put in numeric characters, and I can backspace, right? Which is all good. So let's show you how I did all this kind of stuff. Oh, one other thing I forgot. I put my name, Smith, because he doesn't care. 23 Some Lane Road. And let's say I start putting in a city, right? Again, I've used autocomplete for all the cities in Ontario, right? So I can choose the appropriate city. Like, for example, Barrie, right? And it allows you to do that. You can actually do that at field level, at design time, right? As opposed to coming. If you know, for example, your cities in Ontario are never going to change, why would you access them from? And if you're only going to put cities in Ontario and not in any other province, right? You could use kind of this autocomplete feature. But typically you'd want to go from a database. So here's how I did it. So here from a city perspective, if you look at the autocomplete, just for this example, right? If I go down here and I say autocomplete, it says there's an option that says suggest. It'll suggest the autocomplete option. You can also say append or suggest append. Right? There's different options here. Or none. None is the default. There's no autocomplete, right? Next thing is the collection. Here's my collection of all the cities in Ontario that I kind of entered, right? Now I got this off the web. It doesn't take long for you to get this kind of stuff. These are all the cities in Ontario, and I put it here in the collection, right? And then I have to put in a custom source, because this is the custom source if I want to use this collection here. Otherwise, I have to specify an actual source where it's coming from, like, for example, a database or someplace else, right? And I recommend, obviously, a database would be the best source. You can also use, this is kind of weird too, the file system. It'll actually suggest some stuff from your file system or from, all system sources. It'll look at everything, your web stuff. It'll look wherever to find an autocomplete suggestion for you. It's kind of neat, right? But really useless if you don't really target what you want for the user to see. So custom source is the way you do it, and then it'll suggest entries for the city. And same thing I did for the province. Here's your provinces in the collection, right? And here's all the different provinces in Canada, and it'll suggest those. Yes.
What's that collection called? The property autocomplete.
Autocomplete. Source? Yeah. If you look at in order for you to use the collection that you put in here, you have to use custom source. Okay, that's the only way that it'll access the collection at all. Otherwise, you have to specify another source, like a database or someplace else. Or a file. A flat file works fine too. One thing it doesn't do is it doesn't say, well, depending on which province, change my collection for my city. Right? It doesn't do that, which it should. Right? So if I choose Quebec, it should give me an autocomplete for all the cities in Quebec, as an example. It doesn't do that. Okay, postal code. Actually, first let's talk about amount. So amount has a couple of things. One thing is, actually maybe I'll go postal code first. Postal code, one thing it does is it changes the casing. So character casing value is changed to upper, which means anytime I enter something, and there's different values. There's normal, upper, and lower. So you can force a user, to enter uppercase, lowercase, or normal case. But you can force him here at design time. So there is no validation. He's forced to use, everything he enters will become uppercase. And there's nothing you can do to change it. So if you're doing short forms like Ontario, it's a good use, right? If you're forcing a guy to use it. I also did it here at the postal. I did it at postal code and at province, because you know what? A postal code is all uppercase too, because a user can enter kind of uppercase and lowercase characters, and that's bad. So I wanted to make it simple, to kind of force the user. So anything he enters in the postal code becomes uppercase automatically, right? Okay, let's take a look at the code really quickly. So again, I did a couple different things here. There's nothing really special in first name or last name, but I did do some stuff here in the postal code. And here's my regular expression that I've kind of shared with you for postal code. I've kind of created this Boolean value. I said my Boolean is valid postal code. I've initialized it to false, so it's not initially a valid postal code. And here's my string pattern. I use this @ sign, which remember, it takes the string value here as a raw string. Okay, that's what it does. This character, this caret here, in regular expressions means this postal code has to be at the beginning of my string. I can't start entering stuff in at the end somehow. It's going to look at it from the beginning, right? And it's got to have an ending. So this is the kind of the beginning and ending characters. It checks for beginning and end of line kind of thing. That's the first thing. And then it starts checking to see what kind of characters I can accept. Well, if you notice, it says, here's the brackets. It says anything from A, B, C, E, G, H to N, P, R, S, T, V, X, X, Y. It will not accept a D, as an example, because there are no D postal codes in Canada, right? So you can't use A to Z. That's incorrect. It won't give you the right validation for your code. That's why when I put in HHHHH, it didn't work, right? It also accepts one of these values. So it says one character that's from this selection. One character only. And then from 0 to 9, it'll accept one digit from 0 to 9. Okay? And here, again, one character from this selection here. And again, I have a space, right? A space character.
That's optional, right?
That's optional.
It is an option. Whether they do or not, it's up to you. You can basically, once I put this in here, it says, you know what? Because I put the question mark says they can enter it or they don't have to enter it. It doesn't matter. That's what the option is, right? Because sometimes people enter the postal code without any kind of spaces, and that's fine. I'll accept that, right? And then 0 to 9, one character, right? This selection. And if you notice, there's some other changes here because on the second half, it's a little different than on the first half, right? So this is a valid string, and 0 to 9 again, and then it has to end. Okay? So this is your regular expression. Again, I'm not going to talk about regular expressions in the course. Again, this is our last lesson anyway. But you can, once you've got the string pattern, you got to use this. You got to instantiate a regular expression object in order for you to use it. So here we are. We have regex is actually the class that I'm using. I'm creating this object called reg, right, or reg. I create a new regular expression object, and I put in the pattern that I just created here, my string pattern, which again is a raw string. That's what I recommend you do. And then I say regular expression options ignore case, so I ignore it anyway, and I kind of compile the string itself, right? That's the first thing. And then I do the same thing. I put my ErrorProvider in there to set my ErrorProvider so it's wrong. And then what I do is I say is valid postal code is my regular expression if it's a match with my pattern and the text that I get from my postal code. That's how it works. Now, in order for you to use regular expressions at the top of your code, you need to put in system.text.regularExpressions as you have to use this using statement or else it won't work, right? But I think it's a cool little thing. I recommend, you're going to see regular expressions throughout your programming career. If you haven't seen it already, you're going to see it on the web. Every major language has them, right? And it's a great way to validate your input, all right? Yeah.
I just wanted to add a really good book is
O'Reilly's Master Regular Expressions. There's really cool. Yeah, there's also all kinds of tutorials online if you want to get a quick overview of how to do regular expressions. And there's also websites that you can go on that'll give you patterns for any language how to use regular expressions, and it'll tell you which languages have them and which don't. Right? So there's all kinds of online resources I recommend that you look at, but I think it's a great way of validating your input. And if you don't know how to do it, like I said, as a novice programmer, even some intermediate people don't know how to do it, they can't remember, and that's okay. Remember, it's all about code snippets for me, and if you can't remember how to do it, you can download, instead of making your own regular expressions, like for example, you want to validate a proper phone number. Why would you make your own regular expression for a phone number? There's tons of them already pre-created out there for you. Go grab a regular expression that works for a phone number and then include it in your code. Right? There's nothing wrong with doing that because it's just a code snippet, right? You don't want to create that on your own. Why would you do that, right? And there's many, many other cases where you'd use regular expressions that are pre-created, that are out there already, that are they're in the public domain, that you can come and kind of copy and paste and put into your own code using this kind of syntax, right? And here's my the amount. One more thing before I let you guys go for break. So again, I said I'm checking for is control, right? Because I want to basically allow control characters, like for example, arrow keys to work. If I want to limit input to digits and a decimal place, I don't want to stop my arrow keys and my backspace and my control characters to work, right? I want those to all function, right? So I have to use this is control and then with the e dot character key event, right? That's what I'm listening for, right? Or the input, right? So again, I'm listening for control, I'm listening for digits, and I'm listening for characters that equal a dot, any kind of decimal point. So I'm limiting the input to this particular field. What I'm not checking in the amount is if it's a wacky amount. Like for example, if I have some like 10,000 units, right, as an example, I'm not limiting the user to do that. And that's another way you can limit some user input. Like for example, no one's going to order 100 million copies of something, right? That just doesn't make any sense. And so what you can do is limit the amount, the upper and lower values, right? Which I recommend you do in a form to limit the user from breaking the input somehow or causing some crazy order to come across on a shopping cart. That's bad. Like, you know, you have to limit it somehow. This doesn't do that. All right, so we'll pause it here and then we'll come back with multi-document interface.